Inside the Banjoverse, a podcast exploring the minds of folk music's great artists. If you like what you hear, please subscribe now and do leave us a review. It makes a big difference. This is Enda Scahill from Irish bluegrass crossover band We Banjo 3. Before you freak out, don't worry, there's actually four of us, and mostly just one banjo. That's me. Well, it gives me great pleasure to talk today to Alison Brown, much lauded banjo player living in Nashville. And Alison, I'm going to say that when I started touring in the US for the very first time, 20 years ago this year, and I was in my mid-20s, an Irish banjo player in the truest sense that I really had focused hugely on Irish banjo. And I didn't know an awful lot about bluegrass banjo. This is a long-winded introduction now, but it's going to make sense in a second. I knew about bluegrass music to a certain extent, but not to a huge extent. And we played in Chicago. And we have a friend in Chicago who's a music journalist, writes about Irish music, a radio show host. And he gave me a CD, one of these burner CDs with Bluegrass Essentials. And he said, Andy, you got to go and listen to this. And I've since found out it's had like Alison Krauss and Ricky Skaggs and all of the greats. But the standout track on the CD that he gave me was Leaving Cottondale. Now, there was no track listing. It was just a CD. And it's only years later when I got that album and I was like, oh my God, this is Alison Brown, it's Bela Fleck. And that's your Grammy-winning track. It blew my mind 20 years ago. I listened to it over and that track over and over and over again. And I had it on today and it's still absolutely mind-blowing piece of music. My introduction to you, and we've met over the years since then and got to know you a little bit, but I just thought that was such an interesting way to come across your music and to come across you as a banjo player was like with one of these absolutely outstanding pieces of music. That's 21 years ago, that album, right?
Yeah, well, first of all, thank you. That was a lovely introduction. And it's all going to be downhill from there, I'm afraid. Yeah, Fair Weather came out, I think it was in 2001. So I guess it was 20 years ago. Maybe it came out. I honestly can't really remember. It's somewhere buried in the mists of time. But that's really nice of you to say. I mean, I wrote that tune and when I was playing with Alison Krauss in Union Station. And it was basically kind of an homage to a week that the band spent staying at my grandma's house down in Cottondale, Florida, which kind of culminated in my grandmother asking with a bass player to shoot her dog. And so we thought we better get out of there. And we're driving out of town and saw a sign that said Leaving Cottondale. And so I knew that I needed to write that tune. But not too long after that, I recorded it on my very first record, which I did for Vanguard Records called Simple Pleasures. And then not too long after that record came out, I was in Japan, and a great friend and banjo player whose name is Taku Kawamata, he had figured out a harmony part to the tune. And I thought it was just a great sound with it being twin banjos. So when I was making Fair Weather 10 years after that, I thought it'd be great to get Bela and do it as a twin banjo tune. So the tune owes its inspiration to a lot of diverse and disparate sources, I guess.
I just want to hear about the banjo player and your grandmother's dog.
Well, the dog didn't get shot, but that did inspire another tune called Shoot the Dog, which I recorded on my second record. And the other banjo player, Taku Kawamata, he's a wonderful guy. I got to know him when he was living in the States. He was a sushi chef in LA for a time. But he's been back in Japan for many, many years. And when our band did a tour in Japan, his family actually hosted an incredibly memorable show for us in Tochigi Prefecture. So it's not that far from Tokyo. But that was just amazing in terms of its Japanese authenticity. And also, I know you've played in Japan too. There's nothing else in the world like the heart of the Japanese people for our music. And it's just so utterly surprising because it's something that's, not part of their culture. Even the way this music is more related to Irish culture, obviously American culture, but for Japanese culture, it's completely appropriated. And yet there's so much passion for it. And I don't know, I never am happier playing music than I am in Japan. I just think the people there bring so much love to it.
Yeah, isn't that so curious? Because it's, as you say, it's such a completely different culture to Ireland or to America. But one of the things we've noticed is that the reverence that they have for ancient cultures and for cultures that they love is second to none. And I don't know, did you ever come across the Irish duo that were known as Bridget and Mary, Paddy and Bridget? They were a Japanese couple, and they moved to Ireland. This is probably 20 or 30 years ago. And they learned Irish music. And as the cliche goes, they became more Irish than the Irish themselves. And so the locals christened them Paddy and Bridget. And they brought out at least one album, if not more, under the title Paddy and Bridget. And these two Japanese people playing. But the reverence that they had for the pure tradition of Irish music was incredible.
That's fascinating. Well, I'm going to be searching them out because, that kind of thing just really blows me away. I think partly because I came to bluegrass music as a Southern Californian. So on some level, I was like kind of apart from the culture that created the music I loved so much. And I think that's one of the reasons why I'm so fascinated with the Japanese love of bluegrass. But the other thing is, if you look at the occupation after World War II, you would think that people would not embrace the music of the conqueror's the wrong word, but the winning team. But instead, it was really kind of the opposite. And a lot of people discovered bluegrass music listening to armed forces radio after the war. And that's really how the bluegrass community was built in Japan. So that's fascinating too. But yeah, and then of course there's bluegrass music in Prague, which is where the banjo I play comes from. And that's another fascinating story because they came to bluegrass music as a way of thumbing their noses after the Soviet invasion of the Czech Republic, or Czechoslovakia, I guess it would be. And so to sit around and play bluegrass music was a way to defy the government. It was kind of I would say silent protest, but not quite silent protest. So yeah, music is a fascinating international language.
I didn't know that about Prague and about the bluegrass music in the Czech Republic. That's absolutely fascinating. And I know that in Irish culture that there's an entire form of dancing, traditional Irish dancing called set dancing. And that it came about through Irish people essentially taking the mick out of the lords and the ladies when the English were in occupation. And they would watch these very formal English dances. And then the Irish servants who were working in the houses would go outside and they would do a kind of a peasant version of the dance, which was like way more fun. And that's just become this really vibrant form of dance in Ireland. So it's a very similar story. But take me back to Southern California and your first introduction to the banjo and to bluegrass music. How did that happen?
Well, like a lot of people of my generation, it was Earl Scruggs and kind of the convergence of Earl Scruggs and network television in my case. It was Beverly Hillbillies and Bonnie and Clyde and hearing that music, on the television. And then my dad got a copy of the Foggy Mountain Banjo album. And he was taking guitar lessons. He and my mom both were from a law student who was also a banjo player. And he lent us the album. We made our cassette tape of it. And my dad labeled it hillbilly music. And I just fell in love with the sound of the instrument. So it's really, it seemed so quintessentially American to me, but really not a part of my immediate American experience. And so I was really drawn to the sound of the instrument, but also, the culture that created it too. And so when I was about 16 years old, well, from the time I was about 13, really through high school, I had the very good fortune of being able to hang around with Stuart Duncan, who was also a bluegrass smitten teen. There weren't that many of us. In fact, I think we might have been a party of two. And his dad drove us around to the festivals back east, as we would have said, to experience, real bluegrass culture, Southern Appalachian, culture and bluegrass festivals, because our knowledge of it really was just going to the festivals in California, of which there were some, but we could really only see like the big bands. Maybe you'd see one a year because it was so hard and expensive to get to California, especially back then in the 70s. So like you might see Jim and Jesse one year and then maybe Bill Monroe would come the next year, but it wasn't like these festivals we saw advertised in Bluegrass Unlimited magazine that just had the cavalcade of stars on Saturday night, and then there were more on Sunday night. So Stuart's dad, Emmett, drove us around back east, and he would let us pick out a festival out of the pages of Bluegrass Unlimited magazine, and we'd go to that festival on Saturday, and then he'd drive all night, take us to another festival on Sunday. So we got to see all those amazing bands, and we got to also experience that culture, which is really different from the Southern California culture. I mean, I grew up in a beach town in San Diego, La Jolla. So it was great.
I'm always struck at how important parental influence is. It plays a role in somebody taking up an instrument and then in certain aspect being made to practice maybe. But when you have a parent that's willing to bring kids and expose them to the magic of a festival or, Texas fiddling competition, or in Ireland we have the Flag Hills, which is the huge gatherings of musicians and sessions that go all night. It's so important because there's lots of people that play music but then never get exposed to the society of music, that they can become part of the community, and I think that's where they develop into musicians.
Yeah, I mean, I completely agree with you. And I think that's one of the reasons that I love traditionally rooted music is because it is intergenerational music. And so you can like have your, Stuart's dad take you to a festival or your family. And there's a place really for all the generations in the community that springs up at the festival. And that's a really different thing, I think, than like fashion rooted music, pop music, which I think of as kind of fashion. It's sort of here today, gone tomorrow. And it's really geared for people between 14 and 21 years old or whatever. It's a young thing, and they don't necessarily even want people over that age to be participating in it because then it becomes less cool. you know so I completely agree with what you're saying. I was fortunate because my parents were both lawyers, and they spent a little bit of time in the cow pastures of Southern California taking me to festivals, but it was an incredible relief when Stuart's dad kind of, would invite me to go along with them, and then they would get their weekends off, which I can completely relate to. So I spent a lot of time with Stuart and his family, um, up at their house on weekends, and we did a lot of shows around LA, and I would take, Amtrak up from San Diego to LA, and they'd pick me up, and we'd spend the weekend playing at different festivals or banjo fiddle contests, or, got to play legendary rooms like the Ice House and the Troubadour and the Banjo Cafe, which you would have loved. Um, the Palomino Club, all those places that you hear about when, you hear about even like the country rock scene in LA in the 70s. there was room for bluegrass acts in those rooms also back then. So that was super cool. I was incredibly fortunate because I don't think that my parents' tolerance for going to bluegrass festivals, certainly not like in Scioto Furnace, Ohio, would have been very high. So it was very lucky for me.
Alison, in terms of, we'll say, learning how to play and the technical proficiency that you've achieved over the years, was that something that happened naturally? Is five-string banjo something that you need to learn very carefully at the start in order to develop very good technique? Or is it more of a kind of a gentle curve?
That's a good question. I think of five-string banjo as being very technique driven. And I think that you can get into a lot of trouble if you don't start off with somebody who, kind of make sure you're using the right kind of picks, like don't use plastic finger picks, or don't use like an all metal thumb pick or whatever. I mean, there are kind of big mistakes you can make developing your right hand that would set you back. I had some lessons, not a ton of lessons, but there was actually a San Diego Bluegrass Club that met at the Shakey's Pizza Palace once a month. And I learned a lot just from jamming with people in the parking lot. And that's, kind of related back to what you're saying about like the festival community. It extends even to jam sessions behind the Pizza Palace at a San Diego Bluegrass Club meeting. People are so generous and so committed to playing the tradition forward that if you're a youngster or really any age and any level, people are always so, generous about showing you what they know and trying to give you some tips and help you along. And I found that to be the case even when I was, just a 14-year-old kid going up to JD Crow and JD saying, "Here, you want to try my banjo?" It's like, wow, that kind of generosity is really to be found at all levels of our community, which is one of the things I think is really great. But to get back to your question, I think that if you're learning to play five-string banjo, it's probably a really good idea to have a human teacher or some kind of interactive experience, even if it's via Skype or, Artist Works platform or something like that, to make sure that your right hand gets off to the right start. Because for me, that was the hardest thing to get used to, playing with metal picks on your fingers and getting those picks to where they'll do exactly what you need them to do and not get caught on the strings. That's a really hard thing. And even like breaking in finger picks is something that I think all banjo players dread having to do. I mean, I've talked to Bela about it, and he's mentioned, losing his picks in a hotel room or whatever, and just the agony of breaking in a new set of picks because they need to fit your fingers the way climbing shoes would fit your feet. They kind of really need to be a part of your fingers. So all that to say that if you're trying to learn to play three-finger style, get a good teacher to make sure you get off on the right foot, I would say, but on the right hand with your picks, the right kind of picks, fitting right, angled right, attacking the string right, that your wrist is kind of angled right so that you're getting the best tone on the strings. All those kinds of things are really, really important.
I'm partly jealous in a way because I still haven't found the perfect pick for Irish banjo, and even the ones that I have that I really like, I go through a minimum of 2 every gig and then throw them away. So I'm going through like hundreds of picks a year because once the pointy edge goes off them, that's it. They're done. But there seems to be within five-string banjo this craft and almost an adoration of particular pick makers, because I follow a few guys on Instagram and they have like these beautiful new picks that are made by so and so. The idea that you can get them, mold them to your fingers, and then have them for a really significant length of time. I can only dream of something like that.
Well, yeah, don't over romanticize it, because I'm really jealous of you having like a disposable pick, because imagine like committing your life to not losing 2 little pieces of metal and a plastic round thing, because if you lose them, it's just like an incredible heartache and misery. So the fact that you can just consume them, I'm really jealous of.
You're listening to Inside the Banjoverse in conversation with Alison Brown. When did you know that you wanted to be a full-time musician, professional musician? Your parents were lawyers.
I
Like,
honestly,
did they have a moment when they were like, "Oh my God, you're not going to go to law school and follow in the family tradition"?
right. So I really grew up being encouraged to think of banjo as a fascinating avocation to talk about at cocktail parties in my future career as a really, they were hoping for a doctor. And I did pre med halfway through college and then kind of moved away from that. And so after that, they were thinking lawyer or whatever, but certainly not banjo player. And you're a parent and I'm a parent. And so we can both relate to that. um, but let's see. So I went off to college, like fully expecting to be a professional of some sort, and then went to business school and got an MBA and spent a couple years in investment banking working for one of the big Wall Street firms in public finance, which is basically underwriting bond issues for public works kind of things, has to do with American tax law and all that. And I can see your eyes glazing over. And that's really kind of what it was like for me. I did it for a few years and really came to appreciate that there are people who love getting up in the morning thinking about how you could structure a 30-year bond issue, like what kind of different interest rate schemes you could come up with and whatever, and would come to work loaded for bear, ready to do that. And I didn't feel that way about it. So I allowed myself like a 6-month hiatus because I really wanted to work on jazz guitar actually, and to see if I could write some of my own tunes. And Stuart Duncan and I did a record right after we graduated from high school called Pre-Sequel. And we wrote a few tunes for that recording, but I really hadn't done that much writing of my own. And it always seemed like such a big mystery to me. You know, how do you come up with a beautiful melody like like the theme to MASH to me is an incredibly beautiful melody. How did Johnny Mercer write something like that? So I allowed myself a short hiatus to work on music, and then I fully intended to get like a respectable corporate gig after that. And as luck would have it, Alison Krauss, who I knew through a mutual friend, was, needing a banjo player to fill in for a weekend, and she called me up, and I flew out to Champaign, Illinois, and did a couple weekends with her, and it went really well. So she offered me the gig. So I really kind of slipped into being a professional banjo player. I didn't think of it as something that was something that you could be. And in fairness, in the 70s, you think back that far, even the 80s, there weren't that many like examples of instrumentalists who were making a very robust living playing banjo. So I could completely understand my parents' lack of enthusiasm when I called them up and told them that I was going to leave my investment banking gig to become to work on banjo music. But I think that that's really changed. I mean, Bela obviously has carved a incredibly wide path in bluegrass in so many ways. And David Grisman before him too is showing how an instrumentalist in this music, or kind of in this general music, could be a band leader and do really well with it. So I think that the ideas of how you can make a living in this music have really expanded since back then. But for me, it wasn't a conscious decision. It was definitely, setting my MBA aside and joining Alison Krauss's band. And then when, after about 3 years, I'd done a couple records, or at least one record of my own, and was working on a second record, and then spent a year as band leader for Michelle Shocked. And that's when Gary West and I met. I actually brought him into that band to play bass. And we spent a year doing that world tour, and then, started to think about really how does one create a living in music. And if you are an instrumentalist, it still is a challenge. I mean, there's completely a way to do it. As you know, you guys, you've done it so brilliantly with We Banjo 3. But it still is a challenge, and it still does require one to think like in a 360 kind of way. It's like you've got the performance side of things of your own music, but in our case, we were really interested in artist development of other artists. And so that's really kind of part of the inspiration for launching Compass Records, which we did in 1993, the kind of the predecessor of Compass Records. So, really since that time, we've kind of been tilling both fields simultaneously, like the artist side and the business side.
What do you look for in a new artist? So if you do you go and seek out new artists and go, this is somebody that we can craft, that we can make a career for, and so what do you look for, and then what do you see as your role in the development of an artist?
Oh, those are two really good questions. Well, since we have the privilege of being out there playing at festivals, we have a bit of an ear to the ground as far as what's happening. But and sometimes we'll discover an artist at a festival and feel like, yeah, this is definitely somebody that we want to work with and get in on the ground level. But a lot of times these days, it's really challenging for a record label to do their part if an artist hasn't gotten their career to a certain place. The way the business is moving, like if you want to, kind of create awareness for an artist from coast to coast, they need to be moving at least as fast as the record label is moving. That means that they already need to be touring. They already need to, have developed a fan base to some extent. The barriers to entry that existed when we started the label don't really exist anymore. It used to be that if you wanted to make a record, you had to have a rich uncle or, to be able to afford to get in a studio and record on 2-inch tape, or you had to get a record deal. And now, really, for better or for worse, or for worse or for better, really anybody can make a record, kind of sitting at their kitchen table and get it out there through DistroKid or CD Baby or something like that. So that's the other thing that we look for, really. It needs to be somebody who has a huge fire in the belly for what they're doing and has already taken those kinds of steps and has already established a presence for themselves in the social media space and the digital space, and then physically in the touring space. So I guess it's a combination of things, but it's really interesting how the business has changed. On some level, I feel like it's become more democratic because, the old gatekeepers of record labels aren't really, kind of the gatekeepers that they used to be. But at the same time, we're seeing a whole crop of younger artists that really have no sense for the power of retail, support. For example, like record stores still do exist, and placement in a record store is still a viable thing to have. It's a quiver in your, it's one of the arrows in your quiver. It's a piece of the pie, and a lot of younger artists have grown up without thinking that that's, you know, kind of a thing to even aspire to. And, a lot of younger artists too think about, what they're doing as a complete cottage industry. I can cover it all myself. But, as an artist, I can say that it's really tough. I'm sure you can attest to this too. It's really tough to be a creative and drive the business side of your art. And I think that it's really a good thing to have good partners that understand what you're trying to do, that can help find opportunities for you, that can help lift up what you're doing and get it greater visibility. I mean, you really, at the end of the day, it does become a team sport. It's really hard to do it by yourself.
Mm. Would you say it's easier now or harder now for an artist to kind of break out, to get to where they have a career or a living from music? Like, you can put on rose-tinted glasses and go, oh, if you were really good in the 80s and you brought out a record, that there was a direct route to radio, there was a direct route to festivals. And now there's so much music, as you said, because so many people can record an album at the drop of a hat. And so it's much harder to rise above the noise and become seen. Is that true?
That's how I feel about it, honestly. There's so much out there that, for example, I just co-produced a track for Bobby Osborne, the legendary bluegrass artist, voice of Rocky Top. And I produced his last record, came out a few years ago. And for his birthday this year, I gifted him a recording session. It's like, would it be fun to go in the studio or not go in the studio together, but wouldn't it be fun to record some new music? And he was totally excited to do that. So we did a version of Merle Haggard's White Line Fever, and we put it out as a digital single, and Sierra Hull played on it, and Tim O'Brien sang on it. We got like the cast of the guys and girls that you would get in Nashville, and Bobby sang it up at his house, and we put it all together and put it out. And so that's out there on Spotify, where I understand there's like 60,000 new tracks a day coming out on Spotify. So it's one of those 60,000. And at the same time, my daughter, who's now a freshman at Berklee College of Music, is recording her own songs in her dorm room and putting them out on Spotify through DistroKid. And so that track that we've, it paid the session fees for, paid the engineer and had the studio and, did all that work that, the traditional work that goes into creating music is competing against something that, my daughter wrote and, kind of threw up on the DSPs on her own, just in her dorm room. And so, yes, all that to say, I think it's really, it's such a crowded field right now that it is much harder to get things noticed. And then in terms of just making a living doing it, if you think about the fact that I think you need something like, I'll pull out my calculator and figure out the number, but to make like a minimum wage living, how many streams you need? Like if you need to earn $30,000 a year to make a living, and the average Spotify stream pays 0.0032 cents, you need like 10 million streams a year. That's a huge number. I mean, that really probably puts you in the top, I don't know what, 5% of all things that are on Spotify. So I don't really think that that's fair, honestly, that the DSPs are paying such a low rate and taking advantage of this content the way they have to build their stock value. But nobody asked me. So maybe that'll change, but it'll, when you start at such a low place, it's like they say you never make more than your starting salary in a corporate job. And it's true, if you start at too low a place, even if you keep getting raises, it's really hard to get up to that higher place. I think it's going to be the same case with streaming rates. So that was a pretty long-winded answer, but I guess the short answer would be, yep, it's definitely harder these days.
Yeah. Does it frighten you in any sense? I mean, and I asked that in the sense of being a record label owner. Do you feel that the industry is kind of scary from your point of view, the way that the power has swung towards streaming services?
I don't know. At the same time, it's created a lot of opportunities. So if you've got an artist that you want to get out there, there's a lot more ways to get it out there. Just the way the record labels were filters for artists to get their music created. There were a few publications and a few national radio programs and whatever that were the gatekeepers for us in terms of getting our music to the fan. So now we can reach the fan directly much more easily than we used to be able to. So from that point of view, I think there's cause for great optimism. It's hard to stay nimble and everything's changing so fast now. To be aware of the best channels to reach your audience, you really have to stay on top of it. But, that's one of the reasons why I think, having good partners is important for an artist, because being in your head, in that space in your mind enough to create music, it's a completely different kind of mental exercise than keeping up with all the DSPs and all the marketing opportunities on those DSPs, not to mention the rest of it, the writers that still support this music and the publications that do and the retailers that do and the placement programs within those retailers and on their websites. And it used to be that you could push a button and hit the main things. And now, you have to push thousands of buttons to get the same message across. But, another answer to your question would be, we're seeing a lot of corporate funds that are incredibly bullish on the music industry. And so there's a lot of acquisition happening. So the Wall Street minds see a lot of opportunity as more and more people migrate to the digital platforms and the pipeline gets fatter and fatter, like more and more water's coming out of that hose, they evidently think that there's a lot of value in catalog acquisition. So I think that speaks to opportunity down the road. It's just navigating these transitions. It's challenging.
You're listening to Inside the Banjoverse in conversation with Alison Brown. What's your work ratio like now, Alison, in terms of performance versus the business?
Well, in 2020 or like in hopefully?
in general, let's leave out 2020.
Okay, that sounds good. Well, it depends, sometimes, I'll be like producing a record and, if I'm producing a record, then there'll be days when all I do is sit in the studio and produce someone's record, which is fun. And then in terms of our own touring, we do, I'm not even sure how many shows a year or what we did last year. We maybe do 20 shows a year with our band. And then I've had the great fun of getting to do some shows on the Steve Martin Short Tour, which is, a completely other different kind of fun banjo exercise. And then, some other different collaborations too. I play occasionally with Indigo Girls or Amy Ray or some other folks. So, but overall, if you had to say, I mean, I get up every morning and I go to work usually, unless I'm on the road. So maybe it's, 35% the fun stuff and 65% the stuff I got the MBA for.
That sounds like a pretty good mix, I think, for anybody that's in a 9-to-5 job. They said, wow, 35% fun. That sounds awesome.
Yeah, I feel that way. It's the two things really do inform each other in a good way. I find that, like, you probably know this too. It's like when you get out on the road and you're just getting to be a banjo player, it opens your mind up in a different way where you can kind of have more creative ideas, even if they're, related to business. And so we find that a lot. It's like getting out of Nashville and getting out into a different environment sometimes helps you think about solutions for like a different problem back in Nashville, or a challenge on the business level.
Do you feel that you have failed utterly as a parent because your daughter is in music college and not training to be a doctor?
No, not at all. It's funny, I guess, that she picked the right parents if that's her path. I think that because I waited, like I was definitely an older mom, and the experience that comes with years, it kind of makes it easier to be more open-minded, I think, about the different career paths that a kid might take. For my parents who, had me when they were 25. So when I was making those, kind of big life decisions, they were still in their 40s. And coming from a different time too, the idea of like quitting your investment banking gig that thousands of dollars were spent in preparation for to play banjo, that was just not great news. But for me at an older age, knowing more about how, different ways people make livings, and in a different time where, the idea that you could start with a company right out of college and still be at that company in 5 years. It's like everyone knows that's a 2-year gig. People just companies don't have that kind of allegiance to their workers, and workers don't have that kind of expectation too, that they want to spend, 60 years at a desk and then get the gold pen at the end. So I don't know. I actually think that all those kinds of things have enabled me to be the kind of parent that's more accepting of whatever comes down the pike. And in my daughter's case, she loves music and she doesn't have as much of an academic bent as I did. So it makes perfect sense for her to be at Berkeley. And we know a lot of the faculty there and the dean of the school also. And it's a great place. I'm actually more jealous than anything else.
You list off, Steve Martin, Martin Short, Indigo Girls. Like, it's a glittering array of incredible talent that you get to play with, and it rolls off the tongue so easily. But like, do you get nervous? Do you have self-doubt? Do you struggle with the, oh my God, I'm getting old, I'm getting slow, I'm not good enough anymore, or I was never good enough to begin with? Does any of that come into your horizon at all?
Well, I think that we probably all have moments of self-doubt. And I know that I have always. I don't really find them to be kind of age related, though. One of the things I've learned, like the longer you get to do this, is you kind of feel like, well, I've made every mistake. And I kind of know that you get through it. You know what I mean? I think that you get a greater perspective with more experience. So, like, what's the worst thing that can happen? You kind of can answer that question. The show doesn't stop. You kind of know what to do. And I think that when you bring that experience to a gig like, the Steve Martin Short show, where, you're playing, maybe a couple of songs and you're kind of going from 0 to 60 and then back to 0, because that's the slot in the show. You kind of know that you can do that because you've done similar things. I think it would be more nerve-wracking if you were in your 20s and didn't have kind of that experience that comes with years and years of doing all different kinds of gigs, all different kinds of circumstances, and knowing kind of what the outcomes were. You know what I mean? Yeah, I'm sure it's the same kind of thing for you. Like you had a chance to play at the White House, which I know is like an incredible thing. I'm completely envious that you've had that opportunity. Like how was it in that moment playing for, Barack Obama?
It was
And how did your experience play into that?
it was incredibly nerve-wracking. But the actual playing was fine, and it's exactly like you said. Muscle memory, you got three great guys with you, immediately that the tune starts, it's going to be fine. But I had to do a little speech beforehand, and that was terrifying because you're aware of the importance of the people that are in the room, and you want to say the right thing, but you also want to say something that's reasonably meaningful. So that part was terrifying, but it was an amazing experience. It really was. Loved it.
Well, I'd love to know what you said.
I talked about, and you see, we picked a piece of music that spoke to the influence of immigration. And it was music that was written by Irish immigrants that moved from Sligo to New York. And then, which was completely unknown for Irish musicians to make a living, and make a very good living in the US as a recording artist. And that the influence that Irish musicians had in the development of old time music and bluegrass music, and you had just this mixing of culture. And we played some tunes that were written by a Sligo fiddle player that moved to New York in the early 1900s, and it was to talk about the importance of immigration and the positives that these things, because it's such a hot topic, and maybe now more than ever, and we got to play that same piece at Ann Arbor Folk Festival as well. And it was a really hot topic that time. That was a few years later.
Mm-hmm.
And that's very important to us. You see, it's very important to us musically that we're trying to cross boundaries and we're trying to bring people together. And I think that's a great opportunity in music.
Mm-hmm. Oh, I completely agree. Well, that's awesome.
It was cool. I wanted to ask you about your banjo, and you mentioned Prague earlier, and I know that I held your Prussia banjo when we played Merlefest together, and I was blown away with how unbelievably heavy it is. And like neither you nor I are Dwayne Johnson, but I have gone out of my way to get light banjos because even the heavy Irish banjo is crushing on the shoulders. I'm like, how do you wear the Prussia banjo for an entire gig? It sounds amazing, but it weighs so much.
You lightweight 4-string players. That's a secret part of our training as 5-string banjo players. It's kind of like the Marine Reserves. Every couple of years we have to go do shoulder exercises. Actually, my banjo, and I think they say pruka, at least that's how I've heard in the Czech Republic. So my pruka banjo really isn't any heavier than my Gibson Mastertone banjo. And they're all kind of the same. I mean, yes, they're super heavy. If you have a wide strap, it kind of helps. There is a medical condition called Scruggs shoulder. I think it kind of has to do with, one shoulder like being kind of like that kind of thing. And it's, I don't know, it's painful, but the more that you do it, the less painful it becomes. It's worse in high heels than it is in flat shoes, so no complaining for the guys. But my banjo has like an internal mic, and it has a pickup, so there's some stuff hanging off the coordinator rods, but that's not really adding that much weight to it. I think that's just kind of the way it is. There are some makers that are making lighter banjos, but the tone ring is the big thing that makes the 5-string banjo sound the way it does, and I think that's one of the heaviest components of it, that big metal ring. So, I mean, you just gotta bite the bullet and go for it.
You just hit the gym and get those shoulder muscles working, I guess. Yeah. Do you still practice a lot, Alison? And a double barrel question: are you still trying to improve? Are there goals that you have musically that you're trying to attain?
Oh yeah, totally. It's like one of the best things about this time of being home so much is just the little bit more opportunity to practice. I mean, business has been busier, work's been busier than ever, but I have had more time to practice, and I'm still like an aspiring, jazz guitar player, and I've been taking jazz guitar lessons virtually, which has been super fun. And I've been working on a new record that, I've written tunes to like try to challenge myself in different regards. So yeah, I'm completely, not done trying to learn music. There's so much more that I want to learn. Which is why I'm jealous that my daughter gets to be at Berkeley. Just like different ways to find your way through changes, not so much in bluegrass tunes, but in, jazz tunes or swing tunes. And then there's all the great Irish tunes that I just feel like would be the perfect antidote to, like preventative measure against getting Alzheimer's. To me, is like make yourself learn an Irish tune a day. Like if you can remember all those notes, you're going to be fine. There's just so much out there, and the boundaries just keep getting broader and broader for the instrument. So I recorded a piece with the Kronos String Quartet that I wrote for this record. And, the idea of collaborating with a string quartet's not really new for banjo players. I mean, Bela's done it. Jens Kruger's amazing player. He's done it, as have other people. But, it's a challenge to figure out how to make your instrument fit sonically in a track like that, and how to write a tune that's going to hold up to that kind of treatment, and then how to perform it with the same lightness that they do. So yes, there's like a million things on my to-do list for the banjo for sure.
So what's your writing method? What does that look like?
Well, sometimes it's kind of driven by a need, like sure would be good to have a new song to open a show with, or it would be great to have like the right kind of tune to open a record with. And so then it's more a matter of thinking, like logistically it would be great for it to be in this key or that key, and it would be nice for it to have this kind of rhythmic feel, and then kind of reverse engineering a tune. So that's one approach. And then that's more like the craft approach. And then like the other approach is just when a melody happens to land on under your fingers or in your mind, and then there it is. That's the super fun inspirational approach. So I'd say it's a combination of both things. And then sometimes I've found, like when I was writing tunes initially, after I left my banking gig and was trying to write tunes, it seemed like it was easier in a sense to write music because I hadn't written any. But once you've been writing tunes for a long time and made a lot of records of original music, then it becomes more challenging not to repeat yourself. And so I think that maybe I'm a little bit more critical about which ideas I actually pursue, and try to make them kind of achieve a musical objective for myself, if that makes any sense.
You're listening to Inside the Banjoverse in conversation with Alison Brown. One question that I ask all banjo players: if you had an infinite amount of money, is there a banjo that you would buy?
I'm so lucky because I have one of the Holy Grail Gibson banjos that I bought back when they were still very expensive, but not ridiculous, not so expensive that you couldn't get them. It's a 1937 RB3, about 1934, or no, 1938. Sorry, it's a great instrument, and so that's the one. So if I had an infinite amount of money, I think that rather than buying one banjo, I would buy a lot of different other banjos. Really love the banjos from the 1800s, like late 1800s, the banjo orchestra banjos. I've got a couple banjarines that were made by the Stewart Company, and actually got one banjarine that Santa brought this year that was made by the Cole Banjo Company, a Man in the Moon banjo. So they're smaller scale. They were actually women's banjos. That's kind of how they were marketed back then. And they're still, incredibly playable, and that blows me away after so many years. I love those. So I think that's what I would do. I would just fill a room with all different kinds of banjos.
And then any banjo would sound awesome in that room with all of the reverberations of the other banjos, right?
Yeah, I would think so. Yeah, for sure.
Yeah. What's your greatest achievement, and have you won or many huge dreams and huge goals musically?
Well, nothing like a couple easy questions. Um, huge achievements. Gosh, I'm not really sure how to answer that. I mean, I think that kind of as you go through time, you're just kind of putting bricks in the wall of what you're trying to build. And some of the bricks are little bricks, like you went and played that gig down in Memphis and it turned out pretty well, and that's a little brick. Or you go to the White House and you play for freaking Obama, which I'm so awesome. And that's a big brick. Um, so I don't know. There's a lot of little and larger achievements that I'm proud of. I guess, and then a lot of people would say having kids and they're your best work. And, getting to be a mother and raise human people, that's an amazing thing too. I guess professionally, winning a Grammy, there's nothing like that honor as in terms of being something that's globally recognized as, a really good bar to hit. So that was great. Getting to bring my parents to the Grammys that year was also incredibly memorable. I guess if I had to pick one, that would be the one obvious one to pick. But,
Yeah.
when I won Banjo Player of the Year in 1991, right after Richmond fell, as they say, that was an incredible moment for me too, coming out of having only recently been an investment banker to kind of get that recognition from your peers. And I guess at the end of the day, that's really it. It's when the community that you've, spent your life trying to, be a good member of in turn recognizes you. Those are really the sweetest moments.
That's a wonderful answer, and I love your building a wall analogy. The little bricks and the big bricks. I think that's a fabulous. That's a fabulous analogy, and maybe a lovely way to end. Alison, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you, and I can't wait until we meet up in person again. Hopefully, not in the not too distant future, as we exit our current.
Well, I look forward to it.
Yeah. And give my best here to Gary. And my favorite line, I think one of my favorite onstage lines of all time, is when you introduce Gary on stage and you say, Gary is the best bass player in his price range.
Well, yeah, it's funny. I always say that. And we were up in Canada playing at Celtic Colors Festival one year, not too long ago. And I introduced him that way, and actually had someone come up to me after the show and say that was a terrible thing to say, and I should never demean him that way and should show him more respect. So I thought about that for a minute, and then I have continued to say it since then.
I love it. Alison, thank you so much. It's been an absolute pleasure. Thank you for listening. If you loved this episode, please head over to our website, webanjo3.com, to subscribe, rate, and do leave us a review. It makes a huge difference. See you next time inside.
I want to tell you a real-life story. And it all started in 1984, a place where thousands of bands have performed in a private venue where only 150 people have enjoyed up close and personal the sounds of Gary Newman, Fall Out Boy, Local H, Failure, Youngblood, Robert DeLong, BTS, Mobb Deep, Taylor Bennett, Filter, Elvi, LPX, Catfish and Bottlemen, and the Joy Formidable, just to mention a few. Over 9,850 hours of non-stop music and interviews, all broadcast on TV stations across the USA. It's all dedicated to the new music first, not just in the studio, but from historic venues in Chicago, like the Metro, where hundreds of full-length concerts were recorded. The Smashing Pumpkins, Radiohead, Oasis, Blind Melon, Polly Jean Harvey, Jeff Buckley, and that's just the beginning. Only one TV show has this long-term history, and it's called JBTV. And I've been the host of JBTV since the very beginning. And I'm Jerry Bryant. Join me each and every week right here on Pantheon for this brand new podcast, the JBTV Podcast. Subscribe now and follow us on all the social media for the latest news and podcast listings. Get ready. I think you're going to like to binge on this podcast. Enjoy.